My database is good.
Yeah, database is good. Nick is a database. He knows everyone's lost and wins.
Brandon opens it up with 4-deuce suited. Rampage puts in the 3-bet from the straddle
I get reports.
Same.
with
Like last
ace-jack.
You know, the presidents get updates on security. Nick and I get financial result updates.
2 in the morning, Mike texts me everyone's results, so I know exactly everyone.
2:15, Nick texts me.
I text Airweek verify.
Playing 100, 200, 400, 800 at Hustler Casino Live. It folds around to Brandon Steven in the big blinds, who has 2 people yet to act, including Rampage Poker in the straddle. Brandon playing $140,000 deep, opts to raise it up to $2,300 with a 4-2 of diamonds. If I was in his shoes, I would have just folded because you have loose, aggressive, badly players behind who aren't going to be folding all that often. If you are going to raise, I think you want to raise a little bit bigger to something like 3,200 just to try to really get a lot of pre-flop fold equity, which is what you want when you're going to be out of position. But whatever, he raises it up to 2,300. Over round to Rampage in the straddle. He has ace-jack offsuit and 3 bets straight up for value, which I think is fine and reasonable. If you expect Brandon to 4-bet a lot, perhaps you don't want to necessarily be 3-betting a hand like ace-jack offsuit. They will do poorly against a 4-bet. But if you think your opponent's mostly going to call or fold or only 4-bet with really good hands that very much dominate ace-jack, then you can 3-bet straight up for value, expect to be in good shape when you get called, and then you can fold if you get 4-bet. So depending on your opponents, you should either call or 3-bet in Rampage's shoes. He does 3-bet to 7,000. Brandon decides to see the flop. Let's see what it brings.
You got the same answer? Okay, we're good.
No discrepancy.
yeah. One's off by 10K.
Action flop, flush draw for Brandon.
X back, double check the numbers.
Gutter for Rampage. So Rampage straddled this hand to 800. Brandon raised in the second blind. Rampage put in the 3-bet. Brandon called.
Flop comes King of Spades, 10 of Diamonds, 9 of Diamonds. Brandon has a flush draw. Rampage has a gut shot and a backdoor flush draw. Brandon out of position checks. Rampage goes for a $6,000 bet into the roughly $15,000 pot, which is perfectly fine and reasonable. Again, if he expects to get raised somewhat often, he should perhaps be a little bit cautious betting this because he doesn't really want to bet and get raised with an overcard and a gut shot and a marginal backdoor flush draw. So again, as you expect to get raised more often, this is the type of hand that probably does not want to bet because it's going to be in a tough spot if it does get raised. But again, if your opponent's mostly going to call or fold, as a lot of people do, then betting becomes very nice because you're going to realize your equity. Rampage does go for 6,000 over round to Brandon. He has a pretty reasonable call with a 4-2 of diamonds. I think if he had something like a queen or a jack high flush draw, he should be way more inclined to raise because those just have additional equity to the straight. But with just a very, very weak flush draw, I think it makes a lot of sense to call. If you told me he raised, I wouldn't complain, but, you know, this is a spot that should be quite good for Rampage's 3-betting range. So raising into a board that should be good for the 3-better's range is usually a little bit dicey. So call, try to make a flush, and go from there.
They both have a piece of this flop.
That's crazy, dude.
And I played
Turn is a brick.
He know. He sent a message. Oh, it's really cool. You don't believe him.
Yeah, I see him play.
It'll be interesting to see if
Turn is the 6 of hearts. Brandon checks, as he's going to do with his entire range, I have to presume, in this scenario. Rampage opts to just check it back, which I also think is reasonable, although I don't mind him now turning his hand into a triple barrel bluff to try to get Brandon off of something like a 10 or a 9 or a king. If, in this scenario, Rampage bets the turn and then blasts the river, he's going to put Brandon in a pretty nasty scenario with everything except for 2-pair and better. And sometimes the board's going to run out with a flush or straight and make 2-pair way, way, way worse, right? I realize in this scenario, if a diamond comes, Brandon would have a flush. But imagine he did have something like even 10-9 and the board runs out with a diamond and then Rampage blasts it, puts those hands in a pretty rough scenario. So if you can ever put your opponents in a pretty rough scenario with a lot of their decently strong made hands immediately, like a king, you should at least consider it. Especially if you don't think you have a ton of showdown value and you think that if your opponent has a hand that cannot win at the showdown, they'll bluff on the river. So like imagine the river is a 3 of clubs. Brandon's probably going to bluff the 4-2 of diamonds and Rampage is probably going to fold. And that's not great for Rampage. So I think this is a spot where Rampage could conceivably run the triple barrel bluff. He decides not to, though. Let's head to the river.
This river is a brick if Brandon were to go for it. And we get the gin river, queen of diamonds, nut straight for Rampage, flush for Brandon Steven. Oh my.
It's important.
And Brandon bets 23,000.
The river is the queen of diamonds, which is great for Brandon and horrible for Rampage. As the commentators say, Rampage made the nut straight. I kind of hate that terminology because, in my mind, for something to be the nuts, it has to be the nuts, and the nut straight is not the nuts when there's a flush on the board. That said, it is the best straight, but I think that confuses a lot of people into thinking it's a much better hand than it actually is. Anyway, pot's 26,900. Brandon goes for a solid, chunky $23,000 bet, straight up for value, targeting Rampage's sets, 2 pairs, and straights if he has it. I like this. Perhaps he would like to go even bigger if he thinks Rampage is never going to fold something like 2 pair. And this is a board where Rampage will end up with a lot of 2 pair. If he thinks he's never going to fold top pair, the overbet becomes even better. This is a spot where also Rampage will have a lot of random straights, and you want to get as much money as possible from those, because if you do bet big, I don't think Rampage is going to raise too often with just a jack, recognizing that a jack's probably not going to fold to a raise some portion of the time. And, you know, a jack is a very, very good hand. So I think this is a reasonable spot to go big, and maybe even bigger than Brandon goes, which is, you know, almost the size of the pot. Let's see how Rampage responds with his nut straight.
Is Rampage just going to call here, or is he going to put in the raise? That's what he's thinking about right now. He can beat any jack. Oh, he goes all in.
You said all in? All in.
Brandon was about to turn his hand over. He thought he called. And now Brandon's in a tough spot here. It's another 106,000 to call.
That's it.
Perhaps a little bit of an overplay here from Rampage. Imagine if Brandon lays this down because he thinks Rampage can only have a flush here.
Rampage opts to rip it in for a ton. The commentators seem to think that perhaps Rampage is overplaying his hand. But what I want to know is, what do you think in this scenario? Was Rampage straight up just shoving for value? Or was he bluffing? Take a second, think about it, and let me know what you think in the comments section down below.
Jack 9, good.
Imagine if Rampage accidentally wins this hand.
Huh?
I think my net worth is bigger.
I think in this scenario, Rampage was definitely going for value, but I think perhaps he did not recognize that Brandon would have a lot of random flushes in his range. Now, I do realize that the Queen, Jack, 10, and 9 are all accounted for, which removes a lot of logical flushes from Brandon's range, right? Because a lot of flushes that would normally be in his range can't be there because the Queen, Jack, 10, and 9 are all accounted for. That said, Brandon can certainly have the ace-high flush draw. He could certainly have a king-high flush draw. And he could even have stuff like 8-7, 7-6, 8-6 of diamonds, right? So while there are not a ton of combinations of flushes, because a lot of them are blocked by the board and Rampage's jack, he's going to have some. So while I think Rampage was just straight up going for value, I'm not in love with this play because I'm not even sure a jack by itself will call, because the jack's going to realize that it's chopping some portion of the time or just straight up losing. Maybe in some world Rampage did not recognize there was 3 diamonds on the board. I mean, that would make sense, right? If you had ace jack and the river was the queen of hearts, shoving makes a ton of sense, because then a jack's not going to fold and you're going to stack them. But this is a spot where I think Brandon definitely can have flushes. So I don't like this play from Rampage. Let's see if Brandon makes the call.
I can't believe I'm even thinking about this. Why would you check the turn with the flush draw?
Ace jack. Wow, nice.
And Brandon does make the call finally after thinking it over. And he is going to cooler Rampage for a $285,000 $1,000 pot.
That's a bad.
What a hand. Flush versus nut straight.
After a lot of deliberation, perhaps more than a lot of people thought he would give, Brandon does indeed make the call, and he stacks Rampage, resulting in Rampage losing almost $500,000 in this session. You may say, should the 4-2 of diamonds fold? It's actually close, because in the spot, if Rampage is raising a very polarized range on the river of flushes and bluffs, if you consider the flushes that are possible, the ace high ones exist, right? The king high ones may shove, right? And I would not expect weaker flushes to shove over the roughly pot size bet too often. So while there aren't a ton of combinations of the ace high and king high flush, there are some. Also, I'm not sure Rampage is going to take a hand like ace queen, ace 10, ace 9 with the ace of diamonds and turn it into a bluff. And I'm not even sure Rampage has a whole lot of hands like ace of diamonds 8, ace of diamonds 7 in his preflop re-raising range. So if you think Rampage is not going to turn a pair plus the ace of diamonds into a bluff too often, and he's always going to jam the ace and king high flush, that does put the 4-2 of diamonds in a pretty nasty spot, right? So this is a scenario where it's important to realize that if your opponent is being very, very polarized, the 4 high flush is good, but certainly not the nuts. That said, Brandon's played against Rampage. I'm sure he's watched YouTube every once in a while. He knows he can punt, so don't fold flushes against punters. Brandon makes the call, scoop-a-loops a humongous pot, and crushes Rampage's hopes and dreams, at least for this day.